Yeah, thank you for first of all for having me, and it's an honor to be invited for this meeting. I don't have financial disclosures, but I just wanted to also highlight that I'm part of an ethics work package for Oncode Accelerator. That's a Dutch growth fund consortium, and I'm an ethics advisor for Equate, which currently hosts also the Remap Cap and the recovery trial. And I think my interest in adaptive trials arose 15 years ago. And in collaboration with a statistician, I wrote about some ethical aspects that need attention in these trials. But we also somewhat naively lumped various issues together if I look back at the paper now. And I think what we lump together is the different designs and modifications and contexts. And I think when we are talking about adaptive trial designs or Bayesian statistics, I think it's really important to make clear which modifications are we discussing in relation to which design and in which context. So in general, there has been limited attention for adaptive trial designs or Bayesian statistics in bioethics. The interest grew since 1985 when the publications about the ECMO trial were published. So that was the first adaptive trial that caught widespread ethical attention. It was, so ECMO is the use of mechanical devices to replace cardiac and pulmonary function in critical care. And the researchers felt that it was unethical to withhold the participants from ECMO, so they came up with a different design that was an adaptive trial design. And as we've just heard, it's also the interest also grew in COVID. But other adaptive designs and contexts, in my opinion, so early phase trial designs have received significantly less ethical attention so far. So I wanted, I want to focus on these early phase trial designs, but before I do that, I wanted to also touch a bit upon the ethical assumptions underlying these adaptive designs. On the one hand, if you look at the literature, there is this idea that there are fewer participants assigned to the ineffective intervention by dropping arms or stopping early, so you have less harm. Others highlight the opposite, like the participants have a higher chance of receiving seemingly superior treatment, and then sometimes these claims are combined with efficiency and flexibility claims like decreasing drug development time, or earlier identification of efficacious drugs for specific subgroups of patients, so the targeted therapies, or the adaptive platform trials, where you have the opportunity to coordinate research questions. I think to some extent there is a philosophical problem underlying these assumptions, and that is that they seem to challenge the classic moral concern in research ethics. And that's something that, because we are using people as a means, that's something that we always do in research. And it's usually not problematic as long as we try, if we are able to balance the interests of science with the interests of patients. And you can call this respect for human dignity in a Kantian way. But this is also called non-exploitation in the US, or the primacy principle in the Declaration of Helsinki, for instance. But I think by and large, all these ideas have in common that research is essential to promote and protect people's health. And that some people have to sacrifice their interests for the greater good, and that this is ethically acceptable as long as we are able to balance the interests and the progress in medicine. But when I look at these adaptive trial designs, my assumption is that they increasingly try to challenge this classic ethical justification. And I've constructed something like this. So we must offer the participant the best available dose or treatment at each stage of the trial while learning from each patient that enters the trial, up to a point where trade-offs between personal welfare and societal gain do no longer occur. It's not so much the idea that this balance is challenged, but that these designs do question whether the trade-offs, what we currently still consider as acceptable, whether these trade-offs are still needed. And I think there are a number of caveats here. So I don't think that care and research can be fully integrated. So this is also tried in so-called learning healthcare systems, and we always see trade-offs. So there is always additional research procedures or burdens, and there's always remaining uncertainty or disagreement over safety, efficacy, or effectiveness. So I do think there's an ethical imperative to balance the progress in medicine and the risks to individuals, but there's no imperative to favor so-called individual ethics over collective ethics. And I wanted to point this out because in the ethical statistical literature, if it's a domain, there is a lot of thinking about individual versus collective ethics. So collective ethics meaning maximization of the total benefit of the group, and individual ethics is maximizing the benefit for each participant taken individually. And then in some of these statistical papers, you see that this idea is that ordinary randomized controlled trials favor collective ethics, and then adaptive clinical trials favor individual ethics to treat as many patients as effectively or successfully as possible. And I think this description of ethics in the context of adaptive trials is incorrect. First of all, adaptive trials can be randomized trials, and the goal of research, in my opinion, is not treatment, but scientific and socially valuable knowledge. And I'd like to explain or explore this challenge of my cursor has gone. Adaptive trials a little bit more in the context of oncology and early phase trials. So until the late 1990s, chemotherapy was the dominant form of systemic cancer treatment. In chemotherapy, the safety, tolerability, and maximum tolerated dose is tested in early phase trials. The maximum tolerated dose is then considered to be the optimal dose, and the optimal dose then informs the so-called recommended phase 2 dose. And then these trial designs often use a 3+3 dose escalation trial design. So I'm not a statistician, but this is my interpretation of it. So you you include 3 patients. If there are no dose-limiting toxicities, it's allowed to escalate to level 2. Then you include another 3 more. You experience 1 dose-limiting toxicity, it's allowed to enroll 3 more. So in total 6, and if you're 6 in total, there's only 1 DLT, you can escalate to level 3. But if you have 2 DLTs, you stop, and then level 2 is the maximum tolerated dose. Now, since the 2000s, in cancer, there are increasingly molecularly targeted agents and immunotherapies. And what you see in these with these therapies is that the DLT is not shown in the first weeks, and they often also show response rates in phase 1. So the MTD is considered not always the optimal dose for patients or for guiding subsequent studies. And what you currently see in the literature is that many people try to balance efficacy and toxicity by introducing innovative dose escalation methods, including Bayesian statistics and adaptive trial designs. The rule-based 3+3 is still the most used design, but there are also newer designs. For instance, I'm not a statistician, so I'm trying to interpret what I've read. So it's the model-based design, so the continual reassessment method, where you continuously observe patient outcomes, and you have Bayesian optimal interval designs. It's somewhat more simple than continual reassessment, and more flexible than a 3+3 design. And you have FTOX designs where you try to combine efficacy and toxicity. And some just propose Bayesian statistics, because then people have a higher chance of receiving the efficacious treatment. I think in a very interesting talk that you can find online about the FDA Optimus project, is the question was raised, can we sacrifice some efficacy to gain a substantial decreases in toxicity? And I think there are a couple of interrelated ethical questions. So when does less efficacy become ethically unacceptable in terms of substantial loss of social value? And when does the desire to reduce toxicity reflect an unjustifiable prioritization of individual ethics over collective ethics, if we still want to use these terms? So therefore, it's also important to take a look at what ethical principles may apply. So as Alex has already said, but I think I'm there too. So I think social value is important, as formulated in the CIOMS guidelines, at least. You can formulate it as the prospect of generating the knowledge and the means necessary to protect and promote people's health. So in early phase trials with innovative design, social value could mean something like, could be consistent with the idea that we want to learn from each patient that enters the trial. We may want to have more evidence for the recommended phase 2 dose, and we also may want to learn beyond toxicity in phase 1 trials, because some adverse events show later and can also mean that a treatment becomes intolerable. So another principle that may be consistent or may be applicable here is the do no harm principle. Do no harm starts with a socially valuable question. And if that's not met, then you always harm participants. But if it's met, then you also have to minimize the risks to participants. And it could be consistent with the idea that we have to identify the most optimal design because we want to avoid unnecessary tox. Now, the duty to benefit I may apply, but I find it more challenging. So in cancer, there are usually, or rare cancers, there are usually limited treatment options for small patient cohorts. Large trials are impossible, there are no alternative treatments, and new cancer drugs increase the chance of getting the efficacious treatment in an early phase with relatively low risks. So in an early phase trial, the duty to benefit could imply the duty to maximally benefit patients during the trial. This is something that comes up oftentimes, or the duty to offer patients with unmet health needs trial participation, at least to offer them something. But I think this idea of the duty to benefit needs much more reflection. It also has to do with our conceptions on what of health and disease, or of cure. So what does it actually mean that we want to cure people? And in general, I think we have to say that, so a principle of do no harm is a negative duty. That's a very strong duty. But a duty to benefit is not a duty that we can enforce. So it's a weaker duty than the negative duty of do no harm. So perhaps we should interpret the concerns of maximal benefit as justice-based considerations, and then we can think about a duty to optimize clinical trials that also requires changes in the health research priority setting, the funding, and the logistics of trials. So I think in an early phase trial, the duty of justice could imply that we want to have systemic changes to optimize trial designs, and perhaps also fair access to trial participation if the trial is recruiting. But it's also fair to say that with this focus on individualized treatment and the scarcity, it will not be possible to meet every unmet health need. So it will also not be possible, even with Bayesian statistics, to address all health needs. Now, briefly, I wanted to apply these principles to one of the adaptive mechanisms that fascinated me so far. So I was asked to review a clinical trial proposal protocol in my research ethics committee that used backfilling, and I'd never heard of the term, so I looked it up, and when I took a deeper look, I became increasingly interested. So the idea is that you allocate additional patient cohorts to dose levels below the current highest tested dose during a single trial. And there are typically two types of patients cohorts in your single study. So you start with your first dose level. If that's safe, then simultaneously you do dose level 2 and dose level 3. So you do dose level 2 and you backfill additional patients to dose level 2, and you also assign people to dose level 3 who are exposed to a higher dose. Now, motivations for backfilling here are that you get more data on the safety, pharmacokinetics, biomarkers, and preliminary data. So you have a better informed recommended phase 2 dose, and the lower dose in cancer might also prove more efficacious than the maximum tolerated dose. So the possibility of including more patients in the phase 1 study is also used as a motivation, because there's also relatively low risks to those patients, because you already know that the first dose level is safe. And it may save time, because dose optimization, it's not necessary to do that after phase 2. But I think there are a number of challenges. The do no harm principle already shows that the maximum tolerated dose is not always the optimal dose. But I think we have to avoid that patients are backfilled to doses that show no efficacy and fall far below the highest dose level. So you also only should do it, in my opinion, if there's a reasonable assumption that a lower dose will be efficacious, and there's no guarantee that those who are assigned to a lower dose will be free from dose-limiting toxicities or will demonstrate efficacy. So you should really have a pre-specified plan here for handling DLTs in backfill cohorts. Social value, yes, so you get more data and a better informed recommended phase 2 dose. You are also able to identify, this is what I hear from the literature, or at least by the FDA, that the aim is currently to identify a range of doses and not only the maximum tolerated dose. But there are also other innovative trial designs like CRM, BOIN, and FTOX that may achieve these same objectives more effectively. So at the same time, these designs are really complex and require very sophisticated statistical knowledge. And so in my institution, clinicians say, well, backfilling may be a pragmatic solution. This is something that I understand and can do. And if I have to apply one of these more sophisticated designs, that's sort of not feasible for me in practice. And then I can still meet the idea that I have more information about the recommended phase 2 dose. So duty to benefit or justice, I'm a bit indifferent here. So I think it's unclear whether it leads to individual benefit if you backfill patients. And we could also think about offering more patients with no alternative treatment options and unmet health needs early access to potentially successful therapies with relatively low risks. I haven't touched at all about on informed consent, but I think it's also a challenge how to explain that to participants. So I think one of the currently outstanding questions is has the 3+3 design become unethical? It still provides strong safety, and there can be pragmatic reasons for doing it because you do not need an statistical expert, but there is still room for optimization. So I think the actual question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is currently the goal actually of phase 1 research? Why are we doing it? And so concluding thoughts is that more fruitful collaboration between ethics and statistics is essential. There are many open issues, and there are also very fast moving developments. And I have the feeling we cannot keep up with the pace. Adaptive designs fundamentally challenge, in my opinion, the classical ethical justification of research involving human beings. I think you have a duty to optimize clinical trial designs, but whether we also want fair access to treatments when alternatives are lacking and people face unmet health needs and risks are low, I think that really depends on what we expect from phase 1 trials at the moment. So this needs discussion, and I don't have the answer. So adaptive designs may help to achieve these duties, but there will always be trade-offs. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Rieke. Question.
Thank you for that excellent talk. This isn't strictly an adaptive question, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on intrapatient dose escalation, which is an idea that's starting to gain traction.
Yes, I've read about this too, and so I'm not a statistician, but I think that's one of those mechanisms to also determine the balance between efficacy and toxicity. I haven't compared all these different designs, so I think that's one of the outstanding questions. What is actually the best design in these early phases? If that's more feasible than one of the other current designs, I would sort of think that's good to do. So my worry is that backfilling currently is popular because it's doable for physicians. And perhaps there are other solutions that are statistically a little bit more optimal, but not so complex as continual reassessment methods.
Thanks. This is more of a comment in the sense that there have been several constructs raised in your talk and in Jerome's talk about, like, trying to maximize or optimize, like optimize concern for patient well-being, maximize benefit, reduce opportunity costs. And I think in those concepts are very hard to apply in a context where you have different people who have very different beliefs about what might be optimal, what might be harmful, and that trials ought to be the mechanism that we use to find those things out. And so I think it's actually a bit of a red herring to talk about like a conflict between individual and social, because we should be trying to do, we've got people inside the study that we're intervening on, but the results of the study will be used outside of it. And so if we approve things that don't work, they're going to use them on a large scale on actual people. That's an individual comparison. And so in that sense, I think, so you can say what you think about this. I'm not sure that it's a deviation from this previous view so much as just trying to say, if you've got a diversity of opinion in the expert community, how can we make sure that we're doing the least amount of harm to people in actual practice, given that there's so much disagreement about what's going to be best and so much uncertainty that we don't know what's going to be best, what's going to be harmful. And so these methods are then trying to be like, well, we have to explore that space. So how much of our prior information can we use to explore that space in as minimally harmful a way as possible, but while still having information that's going to be valid to support interventions that have to go out and be used by many, many, many people?
Yeah, so two things. Thank you for your question. So I don't think indeed it is new per se. So I think we still have to balance. I want to say two things, but I forgot. Well, there are always trade-offs still, and what is currently what I see is that it is used to say, well, we have to favor individual ethics over collective ethics. This is at least expressed in the literature. So the idea that you can always provide patients individual benefit, and I don't think you can in a clinical trial. So that's something that I think it's important to still see it as research, even though we try to decrease the trade-offs needed. And I wanted to say something else, but I forgot. Sorry.
Thomas.
Thank you. Very interesting. You're posing the question on, is 3+3 design ethical to use? And I guess the answer depends on a rephrasing of that question. I have a methodology for a particular purpose. I have an alternative methodology that I know is always better. Is it ethical to use the first one still? And I think if the answer is yes to that question, 3+3 design is no longer ethical, because there are methods that are always better.
Yeah, so I haven't phrased this as an operational futility stopping rule, but do think, so you see at one point you see a shift in the interest of leaving a 3+3 towards newer designs. So at least you can judge from what's currently happening that the 3+3 design may become less popular, but it's still the most common used design. And I also think that it requires, all these newer designs require very sophisticated expertise. And it's oftentimes not feasible for in practice. So we also have to see what clinicians want to do and want to understand. So one of the issues could be that we then train physicians a little bit more. But can statisticians always be involved in these newer studies? Or you just use 3+3 and you do not need a statistician. So I think it's pragmatic reasons for not using the for not using innovative trial designs. Yes. Well, alt implies can, so yes.
So yes, I've got too many questions. But just on the current point, but surely the whole point of the Boyne and I3+3 and the MTPI in the similar families is they're not complex to implement. They are very simple to implement. You have a decision table and you just follow the decision table. They're exactly as easy to follow as 3+3. Okay. NCRM, which I love, is more complicated to set up. Absolutely.
Yeah, so yeah, CRM is the most complicated, and what I understood from FTOC so far is that it's also relatively complicated. Yeah. Boyne is more simple compared to the other two. Yes, I agree. Yeah.
So yeah, I'd love to talk to you offline about backfilling. I think. Look, so the second point is I don't think that. We've talked about individual value to the individual and value to society, and they're not always that distinct. When we designed and talked to patients for trials in Duchenne's disease and ALS, a lot of those individuals are sort of paid up members of their disease, and they are very happy to contribute to the science of understanding their disease. They realize they may be going to trial that will do them no good at all, but they are very happy to participate in something which they feel fellow sufferers who come after them will benefit from. So I don't think there's they're quite as separate as you. It's easy to make out in philosophical discussion.
No, so yes, and so I haven't touched much upon my principle, which I call respect for human dignity. But yes, so you can balance those two in a Kantian interpretation. There are two elements, so possible consent and end sharing. So if people share the goals of the study, it's perfectly acceptable to do the study. But I think there, even if people are all on board with the goals of the study, and there can still be trade-offs in individual welfare that are not there if you have a clinical setting, for instance. So I don't think that we can get rid of those trade-offs in the research setting.
John.
I mean, after the previous two questions, I don't have too much to add. I guess, you would never say, we're going to do a phase 1 trial. We don't have a radiologist here to measure tumor response. It's infeasible to hire one. So we're just going to palpate the tumors and do tumor response based on palpation, right? You would say, like, nope, you guys don't have the infrastructure to do phase 1. You probably shouldn't do that. What I find really strange is, decades where it's been clear that model-based designs allow you to get a more accurate dose with fewer patients. That data are completely clear. And yet we have decades of acquiescence to this idea, oh, it's just not feasible for us. And now we have Boyne and these other kinds of methods that make it easy for places that don't have sophisticated statisticians. So I guess I'm just coming back to that question, like, how is it that 3+3, where you're exposing more patients to a drug that 9 times out of 10 is going to turn out to be futile and they're going to have side effects. How is it that continues to be something that IRBs and investigators feel comfortable using when there are alternatives available. And if they are, like, why wouldn't they just like say, we don't need radiologists to do our trials, we'll just palpate tumors? Anyway.
Yeah, so can I take your question as a comment? Because I don't have the answer. It's just, I wanted to throw out the question here for this audience, because I think it's the question that we have to think about. And so touches upon the question what we are currently, there's no mic, it's full.
Internet.
Sorry. Actually expecting from phase 1 trials. And I think that's shifting, but it's shifting quickly. And also to extend that I haven't seen that many ethicists involved thus far. So maybe complexity, maybe lack of interest. I don't know. I don't get it. So thanks.
So one more. There's a gentleman at the back who had your question, your hand up to start with, both this time and last time. Yeah. And then we'll go to lunch.
Thanks for remembering. So my question is more to do with whether this is a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. You've heard from one of the questions about ALS. We might be talking about end-stage cancer. We might be talking about using immunology or immunotherapy for a chronic condition. And they're so diverse, to expect to have one sort of solution or ethical considerations for all of those seems to me not the way to go. So is it best to sort of compartmentalize this into different situations and come up with a different rule base for each of them?
Yes, so I very much agree with you. So I think there are different ethical questions in different contexts related to different Bayesian statistics. And the questions that we raise in a pandemic setting may be really different from the questions that we raise in early phase, in other contexts, or early phase trials may be really different from the confirmatory phases. And I think we need ethical statistical attention for each of those different debates. And that's also why it's, I think, so super complex to come up with one answer to all these different questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Rieke.